Welcome to the channel Sleepy Stories with Jake, where the soft hum of night meets stories that linger beneath the surface of history. And tonight we begin in a place that feels impossibly clean, impossibly safe. Step into any modern pharmacy in any city on Earth, from New York to Buenos Aires, and you are enveloped by sterile brightness, rows of perfect shelves, conditioned air that smells faintly of plastic and disinfectant, a sanctuary of health built on white light and quiet order, and at the centre of that sanctuary you will almost always see a symbol etched into your memory since childhood, a simple circle enclosing a cross formed by 5 repeating letters, B-A-Y-E-R, a mark so familiar it barely registers, because for most of us it stands for relief, for the aspirin taken during fevered nights, for the syrup a mother offered with gentle insistence, for German precision and reliability, for science devoted, as its famous slogan declares, to a better life. And we have been trained to trust that green or blue cross, conditioned to believe that whatever rests inside those boxes was designed solely for our well-being. Yet that trust is a carefully constructed illusion, a polished facade built over more than a century and a half to conceal a far darker reality. Because if you could scrape away the white enamel of that emblem, if you could peer through the microscope of history, you would not see healing molecules drifting in sterile clarity. You would see blood, you would see the mass addiction of millions of children, you would see human experimentation, and you would witness the birth of one of the most destructive substances ever unleashed upon humanity. This is not the tale of a benevolent company that made a few unfortunate mistakes. It is the chronicle of an entity that discovered early in its existence that death can be more profitable than life. The story of how a modest dye workshop in the valley of the Whooper River transformed into the most successful legal narcotics distributor in history, selling pure heroin as a remedy for children's coughs. So set aside everything you believe about medical ethics, because we are about to enter a world where patients are customers and side effects are irrelevant as long as revenue continues to flow. Welcome to the true history of Bayer, and to understand how this entity was born, we must step backward through time, away from the sanitized glow of modern laboratories and down into the smoke-choked chaos of the Industrial Revolution, Germany, 1863. The land is changing at a ferocious pace as medieval streets are swallowed by red brick factories that vomit black smoke into the sky day and night. The air tastes of sulphur and coal. The Rhine, once celebrated in romantic poetry, now runs thick with the chemical refuse of a new industrial age, and in the small town of Barmend, today part of Wuppertal, 2 men form an unlikely partnership. Friedrich Bayer, a salesman with instincts sharp as a blade and an eye fixed firmly on profit, and Johann Friedrich Westcott, a master dyer, a modern alchemist capable of coaxing vivid colour from volatile chemicals. They did not set out to heal anyone. They intended to dye fabric at a time when synthetic chemistry was still in its infancy, and the great commercial prize lay in producing artificial dyes for the booming textile industry. The world demanded brilliant colour, fuchsine, aniline blues, violent reds, and Bayer and Westcott were eager to supply it. Their first factory was not a centre of medical research, but a kitchen of poisons where workers handled arsenic and heavy metals with bare hands. Toxic residues poured directly into the river. The life expectancy of employees was short while profits rose steadily, and yet by the closing years of the 19th century science veered in an unexpected direction, as chemists discovered that the same coal tar byproducts used to create brilliant dyes also produced strange effects in the human body. Some reduced fever, others dulled pain, and Bayer, ever alert to the scent of opportunity, recognized a new market unfolding before him, a pharmaceutical marketplace without regulation, without mandatory trials, without consumer protections, a frontier where chemistry could be sold not merely as colour, but as cure. If you could bottle a liquid, attach a promise to it, and persuade the public that relief lived inside the glass, fortune was waiting on the other side of the label, and Bayer understood this with startling clarity. So the company reinvented itself, expanding beyond dyes into medicine, erecting a vast new complex in Elberfeld, and filling its corridors with the sharp smell of solvents and ambition, recruiting an army of young chemists whose instructions were brutally simple: invent compounds we can patent. They were not chasing scientific truth. They were hunting ownership, molecules that could belong exclusively to them, intellectual property crystallized into profit, and inside this feverish chemical gold rush emerged a tragic protagonist, a man whose name should stand beside Louis Pasteur or Alexander Fleming, yet survives only in uncertain footnotes. Felix Hoffmann. He did not resemble a villain. He looked like countless German chemists of his era, precise and disciplined. Round spectacles perched on his nose, a carefully trimmed moustache, his posture stiff from long hours bent over glassware. He worked in Bayer's pharmaceutical division, under the supervision of Heinrich Drieser, a figure whose ambition and ethical elasticity would shape the catastrophe to come. Hoffmann's motivation was not abstract science, but something painfully intimate. His father, a retired industrialist, was crippled by rheumatism, joints swollen and rigid, every movement a slow torture. At that time, the common treatment was salicylic acid derived from willow bark, but the remedy came with a savage cost. It burned the stomach lining, causing ulcers and violent vomiting, forcing patients into an impossible choice between relentless joint pain or corrosive agony in the gut, and Hoffmann refused to accept that choice. He stayed in the laboratory long after the lamps dimmed, and the factory whistles fell silent. Glass flasks clinking softly as he experimented with structural modifications, searching for a way to tame the acid without destroying its therapeutic power, and on August 10th, 1897, beneath the faint hiss of gas burners and the bitter tang of reagents in the air, he succeeded. Through acetylation he synthesized a pure and stable form of acetyl salicylic acid. He tested it first on himself, monitoring every sensation, then on his father, whose relief arrived not gradually but like a door flung open. The pain retreated and the stomach endured. Hoffmann had created what seemed to be the perfect analgesic. Bayer named it Aspirin. A for acetyl and spir for Sprayer ulmaria, the plant from which the original compound derived, and had history ended there, Hoffmann might be remembered as a secular saint, the man who lifted pain from the world. Aspirin became the most widely sold medicine in history, a small tablet capable of easing suffering and, as decades later research would reveal, reducing the risk of heart attacks, the white angel of pharmacology. But history has a cruel sense of symmetry, because in the same laboratory, on the same workbench still dusted with crystalline residue, only 11 days after the discovery of aspirin, Hoffmann made the mistake that would condemn millions. On August 21, 1897, he continued experimenting with acetylation, this time not with salicylic acid, but with morphine, the powerful analgesic derived from the opium poppy, a drug revered for its potency and feared for its addictive grip. Hospitals across Europe were filled with soldiers and patients dependent on morphine, and the medical community desperately sought a substitute, something that could quiet tuberculosis coughs, the leading cause of death, and relieve pain without ensnaring users in dependency. Hoffmann combined morphine with acetic acid and heated the mixture for hours. The reaction yielded a white crystalline powder, odorless, bitter to the taste, chemically known as diacetylmorphine. He did not realize what he had created. He believed he had achieved with morphine what he had achieved with aspirin, a safer, more tolerable version. He could not have been more mistaken. Acetylation made the compound far more lipid-soluble, allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with alarming speed, delivering its effects to the brain faster than morphine itself, a concentrated detonation of potency. And as was customary at Bayer, the first test subjects were the factory workers and chemists themselves. The powder was administered in small doses. Reactions came quickly and with startling intensity. Coughing subsided almost instantly, but something else emerged, something the reports struggled to capture. Workers described a powerful, unfamiliar sensation, a swelling euphoria, an unshakable sense of strength and fearlessness. Fatigue evaporated, sadness dissolved. Anxiety retreated into silence. In German they called the feeling heroic. And when Heinrich Drieser reviewed these reports, his eyes did not see danger. They saw a brand waiting to be born. He leaned back, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, and said, "If it makes them feel heroic, then we will call it heroin." And with that corporate baptism, delivered with chilling casualness, one of the most infamous trademarks in history entered the world. The angel and the demon had arrived in the same month from the same laboratory, yet while one tablet was destined to soothe suffering, the other would quietly tighten its grip around human will, and what followed became one of the most humiliating chapters in modern medical history, because today, heroin conjures images of dim alleys, ruined lives, and rusted needles. But in 1898, Bayer introduced heroin to the world, dressed in elegance and reassurance, wrapped in polished typography and domestic serenity. The company launched a global advertising campaign so sophisticated it would impress modern marketing firms, and they did not present heroin as a desperate measure for the terminally ill. They presented it as a household remedy. Imagine opening a health journal of the era. The paper slightly rough beneath your fingers, ink smelling faintly metallic. You turn a page and find a tender illustration. A young mother with neatly pinned hair offers a spoon to a crying child. The caption flowing in graceful script promises, "The cough disappears, the child sleeps peacefully. Bayer heroin, the safe sedative for cough." Thousands of free samples were distributed to physicians across Europe and the United States. Small glass vials of pure heroin shipped to doctors with instructions to test it on patients. And the company's official recommendations were chilling in their breadth, advising use for bronchitis, asthma, tuberculosis, and even menstrual cramps. Yet the most dangerous deception, the claim that transformed a product into a crime, was safety. Heinrich Drieser, head of the laboratory and recipient of royalties from every gram sold, published scientific articles asserting with absolute confidence that heroin was not addictive. Bayer even promoted it as a cure for morphine dependency, the logic twisted into something grotesque. If a patient is addicted to morphine, administer heroin. It is more potent. Smaller doses will suffice, and since it is not addictive, the patient will recover. It was like trying to extinguish a fire with gasoline. Thousands of morphine users were transitioned to heroin, only to discover with mounting dread that the new drug bound them more fiercely than the old. Bayer's remedy transformed a medical crisis into a social epidemic. In the first decade of the 20th century, heroin production at Bayer surged. Tons manufactured annually, exported across continents. In the United States, Bayer heroin syrup could be ordered by mail without a prescription. Mountaineers used it to increase endurance in thin mountain air. Opera singers relied on it to clear their throats before performances. It became fashionable, ubiquitous, the Coca-Cola of analgesics. Profits from heroin fueled Bayer's massive expansion. The elegant brick buildings in Leverkusen, the modern laboratories, the villas of executives, each structure rising brick by brick financed by dependency. The company grew into a respected global titan, while beneath the polished surface reality began to fracture the marketing facade. By 1902, letters began arriving at Bayer offices. Letters from concerned physicians, from directors of psychiatric institutions, describing strange patterns, patients who refused to stop taking the syrup long after their coughs had healed, mothers selling jewellery to purchase more medicine for their children, respectable men losing employment and dignity, wandering streets with grey skin and hollow eyes, pleading for another dose of the heroic drug. A new medical term emerged. Heroinism in hospitals in New York and Philadelphia emergency wards, filled with a new kind of living spectre, the earliest heroin addicts, and they shared one detail. Their dependency began with a bottle bearing the Bayer cross. The international medical community sounded the alarm. By 1910, reports detailing heroin's toxicity and addictive power could no longer be ignored. Researchers demonstrated that the body metabolized heroin back into morphine, but delivered it to the brain with a speed and concentration the nervous system could not safely regulate. And how did Bayer respond to overwhelming evidence? Here the corporate face revealed itself fully. There was no voluntary recall, no public apology, only an aggressive defense strategy. Karl Duisberg, the rising power within Bayer, whose influence will loom larger as this story unfolds, instructed representatives to silence critics, claiming physicians did not understand proper usage, suggesting addiction cases were anomalies or the result of patients' moral weakness. Bayer continued producing and selling heroin until 1913, when legal and public pressure became impossible to resist, and even then global distribution did not cease immediately. Sales continued for years in countries with weaker regulations. By the time production officially ended, the damage was beyond calculation. Bayer had unleashed a plague, the genie was out of the bottle, and it no longer offered relief. It demanded surrender. Felix Hoffmann's legacy settled over history like a quiet contradiction that refuses to dissolve, because the man who eased the pain of millions died in 1946 in Switzerland, isolated, largely forgotten, his obituary praising the invention of aspirin while remaining silent about the other creation born on the same workbench. Yet history does not practice selective amnesia. It records what institutions prefer to omit, and for Bayer's executives the heroin crisis was never a moral catastrophe. It was merely a commercial setback, an unfortunate turbulence in an otherwise profitable trajectory, and from that turbulence they extracted a lesson of chilling clarity. Chemistry holds absolute power over human life, and power can be monetized. As Europe drifted toward the catastrophe of the First World War, Bayer's leadership was no longer preoccupied with cough syrups and analgesics. Their ambitions were expanding towards something far larger, because if molecules could be engineered to silence pain, then perhaps they could also be engineered to silence enemies. The innocence of science had evaporated in the flusk that produced heroin, and a new era was opening, one in which chemists would exchange white laboratory coats for military uniforms, an era where the objective would shift from healing individuals to annihilating armies. In the next movement of this story, we leave civilian hospitals behind and descend into the mud-filled trenches of Ypres, where the Council of Titans from the German chemical industry convened to forge a weapon unlike any the world had seen, where Bayer would evolve from selling poison in small bottles to releasing poison in rolling green clouds that seared the lungs of thousands within seconds. The doors of the pharmacy had opened, and what waited beyond them resembled an inferno. 1914, Europe trembles like a powder keg moments before detonation, and Germany sits at its core. In Leverkusen, a city Bayer had effectively built from open land to house its industrial empire. The chimneys no longer release only pale steam. They exhale something thicker, darker, a haze that clings to the throat and stings the eyes. Felix Hoffmann had been the naive scientist who created heroin by accident, but the man now seated at the throne of Bayer was of an entirely different species. His name was Karl Duisberg. He was not merely a chemist, but an industrial sovereign, a strategist, the Napoleon of chemical industry, his imperial moustache and rigid posture completing the portrait of authority. He resided in a palatial villa within the factory grounds, surrounded by manicured gardens, ornamental ponds, and silent servants, while only a short distance from his windows thousands of labourers inhaled toxic vapours drifting from production halls. Duisberg's worldview was terrifying in its simplicity. Chemistry is power, and the duty of industry is not to serve humanity, but to serve the German state and its shareholders. When war erupted in August 1914, most companies reacted with fear and uncertainty. Duisberg recognized opportunity. The German army, the most formidable war machine on earth, faced a critical vulnerability. Britain's naval blockade prevented the import of Chilean saltpeter, an essential ingredient in gunpowder and explosives. Without nitrates, the Kaiser's artillery would fall silent within 6 months. Panic spread through the high command, military leaders summoned industrial magnates, and in that moment Karl Duisberg and his counterparts in the chemical sector forged a Faustian pact that would reshape modern warfare. They promised the Kaiser that German science would supply what geography denied. "Give us funding," they insisted, "and we will pull explosives from the air." They referred to nitrogen fixation, the process developed by another infamous figure, Fritz Haber. Bayer alongside BASF and Höchst transformed their production lines almost overnight. Machines that once pressed aspirin tablets were reconfigured. Tanks that blended cough syrups were filled with nitric acid and toluene. The pharmaceutical facade no longer pretended concern for public health. It became the arsenal of the Reich. In Leverkusen, millions of tons of high explosives were manufactured. Every shell that tore through trenches along the Marne, every blast that shattered earth along the Somme, carried the invisible signature of the chemical empire Duisberg commanded. Yet explosives were only the beginning. Trench warfare had stagnated into a deadly stalemate. Generals demanded something new, something capable of flushing soldiers from fortified burrows, something that killed not through brute force but through scientific terror. And Karl Duisberg found the answer in the same dye laboratories that once produced brilliant textile colours. April 22nd, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. A spring afternoon unfolds with deceptive serenity. In the Allied trenches, the French and Algerian soldiers allow their exhausted bodies a rare moment of stillness. Boots sunk into damp clay, rifles resting against sandbags slick with condensation. Months of fighting have carved hollows beneath their eyes. Yet this afternoon the front feels unnaturally quiet. A silence so complete it hums in the ears, and at 5 in the evening the sentries begin to murmur and point toward the German lines. Something is moving there, but it is not infantry and not artillery smoke. It is a low creeping cloud, a dense yellow-green vapour hugging the ground, advancing slowly under a mild northern breeze as if the earth itself were exhaling poison. The soldiers watch with puzzled curiosity, some shading their eyes against the pale light, wondering if it is smoke meant to conceal an advance, or some strange meteorological trick. And then the cloud reaches the forward trench, and the world ruptures. The air fills with a biting stench, rotting pineapple fused with the sting of concentrated chlorine. Men begin to cough, but the sound is wrong. Violent spasms wrenching their chests, hands claw at throats, eyes burn as though splashed with acid. Chlorine gas reacting with moisture inside the lungs forms hydrochloric acid. The soldiers are dissolving from within, drowning in their own fluids while standing on dry ground. Panic detonates along the trench line. Thousands stumble blindly out of the earthworks, spitting blood, collapsing with skin turning blue from suffocation. Within minutes, the French line disintegrates. 6,000 men die that evening in a manner so grotesque, even hardened veterans weep at the sight. The gas did not appear by accident. It was manufactured, compressed, transported, and supplied by the great German chemical corporations with Bayer at the forefront. Karl Duisberg did not recoil in horror. He felt pride. He visited the front to witness the results personally. For him and for Fritz Haber, the gas was not a war crime, but a humane method of shortening conflict. In private clubs thick with cigar smoke, they would remark that death by gas was gentler than dismemberment by shell fire. Bayer committed itself fully to chemical weapons production. Within its factories, a school of chemical warfare was established, a corporate academy, where German officers were not taught healing, but the optimal dispersal of poison according to wind direction and terrain. Bayer scientists, the same minds once searching for relief from rheumatism, now calculated the concentration of phosgene required to annihilate a battalion in minutes. Escalation came swiftly. Chlorine was visible and therefore avoidable, so they engineered something more insidious. Phosgene, an invisible gas with the faint odour of freshly cut hay, lethal hours after inhalation, as lungs silently filled with fluid while victims slept. And then arrived the monarch of horrors, mustard gas known as the Yellow Cross, mass-produced in Bayer facilities. It did not need to be inhaled. It blistered skin on contact, penetrated fabric. Soldiers who survived exposure emerged blinded, their bodies covered in enormous yellow-filled blisters, coughing fragments of their own bronchial lining, a chemical torment designed to linger for weeks before death. For 4 years, German science, financed by Bayer and its partners, transformed Europe's battlefields into laboratories of extermination. And as soldiers died, the company's share prices rose. War proved to be exceptional business. 1918 arrives. Germany loses. The Kaiser flees. The Treaty of Versailles attempts to cripple the nation. The Allies seize Bayer's patents. In the United States, its subsidiary is auctioned as enemy property, giving birth to Sterling Drug, which would sell Bayer aspirin in America for decades without ties to Germany. It appeared to be the end. Bayer had lost markets, international patents, and reputation. But Karl Duisberg did not accept defeat, surveying the post-war landscape of hyperinflation and political chaos. He reached a conclusion that would shape the 20th century. Competition is a luxury we cannot afford. We must become a single body. He proposed not an alliance, but total consolidation of the German chemical industry. Bayer, BASF, Höchst, Agfa, Griesheim Elektron, Weiler Mir. The very giants that had produced gas and explosives would unite under one command, and in 1925 his vision materialized. E.G. Farben Industrie AG was born, the name technical and dull, a community of interests of the dye industry, yet in reality the most powerful corporation in Europe, perhaps the world. E.G. Farben was no ordinary company. It functioned as a supranational state. It possessed its own foreign policy, its own industrial espionage network, coal mines, power plants, banks, railways. It controlled all German dye production, the vast majority of explosives, and nearly the entire pharmaceutical supply. And if you were a German citizen in 1925, IG Farben did not merely influence your life. It owned it. The aspirin you swallowed belonged to them. The photographic film inside your camera belonged to them. The fertilizer feeding the soil that fed your body belonged to them. And though you could not yet imagine it, the gas that might one day steal your breath would also carry their signature. Karl Duisberg rose to the chairmanship of the Supervisory Council and stood like a sovereign atop this new chemical Olympus. He commissioned the largest office building in Europe in Frankfurt, the IG Farben headquarters. a colossal structure of travertine and marble radiating authority, corridors echoing with polished footsteps, elevators programmed not to stop on every floor so that executives remained physically elevated above clerks and technicians, hierarchy embedded in architecture. Within those Frankfurt offices, the directors, who half-jokingly called themselves the Council of Gods, began drafting the future with slide rules and fountain pens. The Weimar Republic did not concern them. Democracy did not concern them. They valued order, efficiency, and profit, and toward the end of the 1920s they began noticing an agitating politician in Munich, a man with a small moustache and a hypnotic cadence, who spoke of restoring German greatness, breaking the chains of Versailles, and conquering living space in the East. At first, the corporate aristocrats of IG Farben regarded Adolf Hitler with contempt, a vulgar Austrian corporal performing for crowds, but Duisberg and his successors were pragmatists. They listened to what he promised: rearmament, economic autarky, the destruction of communist labor unions. Hitler required synthetic rubber for trucks, because Germany possessed no tropical colonies. He required synthetic fuel for tanks, because Germany had no petroleum reserves, and only one entity on Earth could produce those miracles at industrial scale. E.g. Farben, chemistry and Nazism fit together with chilling symmetry. Both believed in technical supremacy. Both believed the world could be reshaped through will and science, and both operated without human compassion. In 1932, 1 year before Hitler seized power, a decisive meeting took place. IG Farben executives opened their ledgers and financed the Nazi electoral campaign with millions of marks, an investment whose returns would surpass anything in corporate history. When Hitler became Chancellor, IG Farben became the regime's industrial backbone, and Bayer, as a founding pillar of the cartel, stood prepared for its darkest act. The trajectory had already moved from heroin to mustard gas. Now it advanced towards something more horrifying. Industrialized slavery and mechanized genocide. The stage was set. The blueprints for a factory at Auschwitz were about to be drawn, and Zyklon B, a simple cyanide-based pesticide stored in innocuous containers, waited for its monstrous destiny. Berlin, February 20th, 1933. The night air is brittle with cold. Yet inside the official residence of the Reichstag president, the atmosphere crackles with tension and opportunity. Hermann Göring has summoned Germany's industrial elite, the wealthiest men in the nation, step from dark limousines, coats brushing against frosted air, among them the executives of IG Farben walking with the assurance of those who understand the future is negotiable, the spectral influence of Karl Duisberg hovering over their decisions. Adolf Hitler enters the room without theatrics. He does not shout as he does in public squares. He speaks calmly to businessmen, promising order, promising the crushing of unions, promising that the German army will again become the greatest in the world, but above all he asks for something practical. Funds, money to secure the electoral victory that will consolidate absolute power. The IG Farben directors do not hesitate. They are pragmatic men. They understand that the war Hitler envisions will require chemicals on an unprecedented scale. That night the cartel signs a check for 400,000 Reichsmarks, the largest contribution of the evening, the down payment on a partnership that will transform the laboratories of Bayer and its allies into architects of an industrial nightmare. From that moment the distinction between the Nazi state and IG Farben dissolves. They function as a single organism. The government supplies capital and objectives. The corporation supplies science and execution. Hitler knows that without the chemists of Leverkusen and Frankfurt his tanks would halt without fuel, and his soldiers march barefoot without synthetic rubber. IG Farben becomes the chemical ministry of the Third Reich. Yet while engineers refine processes to synthesize gasoline from coal, within pesticide divisions a different horror is forming, one measured not in octane ratings but in human lives per minute. And to understand its origin, we return briefly to Bayer Laboratories in the 1920s, where a team of scientists had perfected a product intended for public hygiene. Zyklon B consisted of small gypsum pellets saturated with hydrogen cyanide, a compound engineered for efficiency rather than spectacle, originally deployed to disinfect barracks, ships and railway cars by killing lice that spread typhus, a public health tool shaped by chemistry and necessity, and by law the pellets were required to contain a warning agent, an irritant that released a sharp odour and caused the eyes to water. A vital safeguard, because if a human sensed that acrid sting, they knew to flee. That warning was the boundary separating pesticide from weapon. Yet in 1941, after Nazi leadership resolved that mass killing would be industrialized, Purchase orders arriving at Degesch, the IG Farben-controlled distributor, began to change in tone and specification. The SS submitted an unusual technical request. Produce Zyklon B without the warning additive. They wanted the gas odorless. They wanted victims unaware they were dying until escape was impossible. IG Farben executives could have refused, citing safety regulations or medical ethics. Instead, they accelerated production, fully aware of the purpose an odorless pesticide would serve inside a concentration camp. The gas that once saved lives by killing lice would become the principal instrument for exterminating millions. Each canister shipped to Auschwitz represented revenue recorded in ledgers and confirmed in invoices, death reduced to supply chains, delivery schedules, and quality control metrics. The pharmacy had found its flagship commodity, murder by catalogue. Yet gas was only one component of the enterprise. IG Farben pursued something even more ambitious: the construction of the largest chemical complex in human history, an industrial city designed as a monument to German technological supremacy. It was named the Bühne plant after the synthetic rubber it would produce. The site required 3 essentials: rail access, abundant water, and an inexhaustible source of cheap labour. And they found the ideal location in Upper Silesia near a rail junction called Oświęcim. There, IG Farben did not merely cooperate with the Auschwitz concentration camp. They built their own camp, Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz, the first concentration camp financed, constructed, and administered by a private corporation. A pharmaceutical and chemical enterprise now possessed its own slave labour force. The scale of construction defied comprehension. Thousands of tons of steel, kilometres of piping, reactors rising like metal cathedrals, and beneath these structures a mass of human beings reduced to replaceable components. Prisoners arriving in cattle cars underwent immediate selection. Those deemed fit for labour were not sent directly to SS gas chambers. They were sent to the IG Farben factory, leased by the company from the Nazi state at fixed daily rates. 4 Reichsmarks for a skilled worker, 3 for an unskilled labourer. To Bayer and IG Farben management, these men and women were caloric inputs converted into output. The calculation was brutally simple. A prisoner must produce more value in labour than the cost of food and shelter, and since food consisted of murky water and potato peels and shelter meant rat-infested wooden barracks, profit margins were immense. Life expectancy at Monowitz was even lower than in other camps. The work constructing the Bühne plant was punishing beyond endurance. Prisoners carried 50-kilogram sacks of cement while running under the whips of German overseers. If a man collapsed and could not stand, a signal was given. He was removed and transported on the next truck to Auschwitz, to Birkenau, to be killed with Zyklon B produced by the very company for which he had just laboured. A perfect and horrifying system of human recycling. And it is here that the secret Bayer archives demand attention, because they reveal the apex of scientific dehumanization. While the synthetic rubber complex expanded, Bayer's pharmaceutical laboratories in Leverkusen required data. They sought to test new typhus vaccines, experimental anesthetics, and chemical compounds, and the laws of science demanded human trials. At this point, business correspondence became evidence of crimes against humanity. Bayer executives wrote to the Auschwitz commandant with the detached tone of office procurement, requesting a batch of 150 healthy women for testing a new preparation. When the camp administration replied with a price of 200 Reichsmarks per woman, Bayer negotiated. The cost was excessive. They offered 170 per subject. That difference of 30 marks stands as a measure of corporate morality in that era, and eventually the transaction was concluded. The 150 women were delivered as requested, transported like inventory into sterile rooms that smelled of disinfectant and hot metal, where Bayer scientists prepared syringes filled with experimental compounds. They were not attempting to heal these women, they were measuring decline, timing organ failure, documenting the devastation drugs inflicted upon the human body. Clipboards recorded pulse rates, tremors, discoloration, respiratory collapse. The final report typed on official Bayer letterhead concluded with chilling efficiency. The experiments have concluded. All subjects have died. We will contact you regarding the next shipment. All subjects have died. No expression of regret. No internal inquiry. Only the procedural need for additional material. Yet the laboratories were not the only place where science and cruelty converged. Another figure operated in Auschwitz in close collaboration with industrial research. A man whose name would become synonymous with medical horror. Dr. Joseph Mengele. He was not an isolated madman, but a researcher seeking academic prestige in the new Germany, and much of his funding and pharmaceutical supply flowed from E.G. Farben. The company provided experimental drugs for testing on twins and children. In return, Mengele supplied organs, blood samples, and meticulous autopsy notes to corporate laboratories for analysis. A steady traffic of human tissue travelled from the crematoria of Auschwitz to microscopes in Leverkusen. Science for a better life had mutated into science for efficient death. As the war staggered toward its inevitable end, the Buna plant at Auschwitz never produced a single gram of synthetic rubber. Allied bombing and technical failures prevented it. That failure did not prevent profit. IG Farben invoiced each stage of the project. Construction, chemical deliveries, Zyklon B supplied to the SS, medical experimentation. Auschwitz became an immense billing operation structured around extermination. Executives lived within a cocoon of privilege while their enslaved labourers starved a few kilometres away. They attended formal dinners in factory halls, crystal glasses raised in champagne to toast technical progress, convinced they were architects of a new global order, believing history is written by victors and that they themselves were untouchable. Even in January 1945, with the Red Army approaching, their primary concern was not evacuation, but documentation. Files were burned, records shredded, purchase orders for the 150 women, gas supply contracts, inspection photographs of slave barracks, all were to vanish. Yet German bureaucracy proved too thorough for complete erasure. Copies existed in other departments. Subordinate clerks failed to destroy everything. When Allied forces entered Leverkusen and Frankfurt, they uncovered the paper trail of the pharmacy. The liberation of Auschwitz revealed an E.G. Farben factory encircled by corpses. American prosecutors led by Telford Taylor struggled to comprehend the scale of what they found. They were not trying crude soldiers, but some of the most educated men in Germany. Chemists with doctorates, financial strategists, industrial leaders. In 1947, the IG Farben trial began in Nuremberg, the sixth of the subsequent proceedings. Prosecutor Taylor spoke with blunt clarity in his opening statement. These men are not merely war criminals, they are the indispensable facilitators of evil. Without IG Farben, Hitler would not have had gas for his chambers, rubber for his tanks, or fuel for his aircraft. They are the true architects of the Holocaust. Bayer executives sat in the dock appearing indignant, insisting they were businessmen following orders, claiming ignorance of the gas chambers despite supplying the gas and managing the adjacent slave camp. For a moment it seemed the world might deliver justice, but geopolitics intervened. The Cold War was emerging. The United States required a strong rebuilt Germany to counter the Soviet Union, and rebuilding Germany required chemists, executives, industrial infrastructure. It required E.G. Farben. What followed the trials became one of the most bitter insults to the victims. Sentences were astonishingly lenient. Many executives who had signed slave labour orders received only a few years in prison. Others were acquitted. And most astonishing of all, the dissolution of IG Farben ultimately resulted in the rebirth of its original components. In 1952, Bayer was reborn as an independent company. The same men who had administered terror during the war simply removed the uniform of the cartel and slipped into tailored suits, bearing the insignia of the new Bayer. The transformation executed with the ease of a costume change. Fritz Termeer, a former IG Farben executive convicted at Nuremberg for slavery and mass murder, walked out of prison after only 5 years for good behaviour, and what followed felt less like justice than a grim satire of it. He was appointed chairman of Bayer's supervisory board. The man who oversaw the machinery of Auschwitz returned to preside over science for a better life. The pharmacy did not merely survive the war, it emerged stronger, cleansing its public image beneath the glow of the German economic miracle, converting wartime laboratories into facilities producing modern pesticides and mass-market medicines. And the world chose amnesia because it needed pills, fertilizers, and chemicals from Leverkusen. Yet the shadow of Auschwitz never fully withdrew. A corporation's DNA does not vanish through rebranding or advertising campaigns. Patterns of manipulation, ethical indifference, and the primacy of profit over human life would surface again in later decades through contaminated blood scandals and toxic herbicides. In the next movement, we'll see how post-war Bayer conquered global markets while burying its Nazi past beneath layers of publicity and corporate optimism. The devil no longer wore the black uniform of the SS. He wore a laboratory coat and a corporate smile. This is the 4th chapter of 6, the chapter of post-war amnesia. The story of how justice bent before political convenience, and how men who should have spent the remainder of their lives imprisoned for crimes against humanity returned to luxury offices bearing presidential titles. 1945. Germany resembles a lunar wasteland of crushed brick, drifting smoke, and stunned silence. In Leverkusen, the chimneys have fallen silent. Buildings once representing the frontier of scientific achievement stand partially shattered, scarred by Allied bombing. The Council of Gods has fallen from its summit. Executives who once toasted the efficiency of Auschwitz now hide in basements, feeding documents into flames while listening to the rumble of American tanks crossing the Rhine. It appears the world is finally ready to settle accounts with the pharmacy. Allied soldiers entering IG Farben facilities discover more than laboratories. They uncover evidence of depravity that defies comprehension. Invoices for Zyklon B gas. Purchase orders listing 150 women from Auschwitz priced at 170 Reichsmarks each. Research reports detailing the time required for human lungs to collapse under exposure to chemical agents. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon grasping the scale of industrial complicity in the Holocaust, is unequivocal. He orders IG Farben dismantled completely, declaring the corporation a threat to world peace. Initial plans call for tearing out pipelines, selling reactors, permanently prohibiting these men from manufacturing even a single aspirin. The world demands justice, and for a moment justice seems imminent. Yet while the rubble of war still radiates heat, a new fear seeps through the fractures of international diplomacy. A fear buyer's leadership understands how to exploit with chilling precision. The Cold War is beginning, an iron curtain descends across Europe, and suddenly the United States and Britain confront an uncomfortable reality. To contain the Soviet Union, West Germany must become an economic power once again, and to rebuild that power, they require chemists, administrators, industrial expertise. They require the same men who served Hitler. Justice stands on the verge of sacrifice upon the altar of geopolitical necessity. The pharmacy is about to receive a second chance delivered with astonishing cynicism. In August 1947 begins what should have been the definitive trial of corporate power, the IG Farben trial, the 6th of 12 proceedings before US military tribunals in Nuremberg. In the dock cite not uniformed soldiers, but 24 of Germany's most educated executives, doctors, engineers, financiers, the elite of Bayer, BASF, and Höchst. Chief Prosecutor Telford Taylor opens the case with words that still echo through the archives of history. These men are not merely war criminals in the traditional sense, Telford Taylor's voice carried through the courtroom with restrained force, the air thick with paper dust and the quiet scratch of pens. They are the technocrats of extermination. Without their science, without their logistics, without their corporate ambition, Hitler could not have executed his plans of conquest and genocide. The charges were overwhelming: planning aggressive war, plundering property in occupied territories, mass enslavement and murder. And the evidence surrounding the Buna plant at Auschwitz-Monowitz was irrefutable. Prosecutors presented documents signed by the defendants themselves in which prisoner mortality rates were discussed as if they were variables in a production equation. Yet the accused displayed no visible remorse. They appeared before the tribunal in immaculate suits, composed and confident, their composure provoking anger among survivors seated in the gallery. Their defense unfolded as a masterpiece of legal manipulation. They claimed to be simple businessmen without influence over political decisions. They insisted they did not know how Zyklon B was used, despite managing subsidiaries that distributed it. They argued the use of slave labour had been ordered by the SS, and that refusal would have endangered their own lives. We were merely following the laws of wartime economics, they said. And in their language, the 150 women purchased from Auschwitz were not people but statistical units. The world expected exemplary justice, executions for the architects and life imprisonment for the rest. But the political climate had shifted. In Washington, the priority was no longer punishment but reconstruction. Germany was to become a bulwark against communism, and American judges, influenced by this change in strategic wins, delivered sentences that horrified victims. Of the 24 defendants, 10 were acquitted outright. The remaining 13 received sentences ranging from 1 to 8 years, and even more bitterly, time already spent in custody was deducted from their terms. The message resonated with chilling clarity. Corporate crime, even when entwined with genocide, carries a modest price if you remain useful to the new custodians of global order. Fritz Termeer, who personally supervised construction of the slave labour factory at Auschwitz and defended the use of prisoners by remarking they were not accustomed to work anyway, was sentenced to 7 years and released in 1950 after serving less than 3. The pharmacy had not merely survived judgment, it had prevailed. The path to resurrection lay open. 1951 arrived, and E.G. Farben, the giant Eisenhower had intended to dismantle, was formally divided but not destroyed. It separated into its original components, Bayer, BASF, and Höchst, as if the organism had split into 3 bodies carrying identical genetic memory, identical ambition, identical leadership. Bayer officially re-emerged in Leverkusen, and here the story takes on a disquieting clarity. One might expect that after such a scandal, the company would distance itself from former Nazi leadership, seek new faces, new ethics, a decisive break with the past. Instead, it did the opposite. In an act of unprecedented cynicism, the same men released from Allied prisons were invited to reclaim their former positions. Fritz Termeer, the man who had negotiated the purchase of women from Auschwitz, a convicted war criminal, did not retreat into obscurity. In 1956, he became chairman of Bayer's supervisory board. The overseer of industrialized death now presented as the face of a democratic corporation. He was not alone. The roster of post-war Bayer leadership resembled a census drawn from the Nuremberg trials. Ulrich Heberland, another E.G. Farben veteran, assumed the role of chief executive. Karl Wurster, another collaborator, led BASF. The pharmacy remained open, and the same pharmacists had returned behind the counter. What followed was the most extensive image rehabilitation campaign in corporate history. Bayer needed the world to forget gas chambers and remember aspirin. Astronomical sums flowed into advertising. The slogan, "Science for a Better Life," etched itself into consumer consciousness. The Bayer cross glowed once more in stadiums, pharmacies and billboards from New York to Tokyo. International patents were reclaimed. Legal battles fought to restore ownership of the aspirin name in global markets. The company presented itself as the emblem of the German economic miracle, a peaceful enterprise of scientists devoted to progress and human health. Leverkusen prospered again, and the residents, many of whom had worked in the factory during the war, remained silent. The past was buried beneath a mountain of Deutsche Marks and promises of prosperity, yet a corporation's genetic code does not mutate through advertising campaigns, and the culture forged under Karl Duisberg and the barons of E.G. Farben, profit at any cost, continued to echo through the corridors of Leverkusen, and by the 1960s that absence of restraint would surface again in a chain of disasters, proving the devil had not vanished. He had simply exchanged the black uniform for a white laboratory coat and the practiced smile of a salesman. Although Bayer publicly distanced itself from several pharmaceutical scandals of the era, the mentality dominating the post-war German chemical industry remained fundamentally unchanged. One emblematic episode was the thalidomide tragedy, marketed in Germany as Contaminated, and though the original manufacturer was Grunenthal, the patent networks, chemical expertise, and marketing culture of the period were deeply influenced by the Leverkusen school. While Bayer pushed aggressively into emerging markets across Latin America and Southeast Asia, regions where regulatory frameworks remained fragile or non-existent, there the company discovered an ideal landscape for expansion, introducing extremely toxic pesticides, many derived from wartime research into nerve agents and poison gases. To farmers in Brazil and Colombia, they sold chemicals lethal, not only to insects, but to humans. The same scientific tradition that had calculated the lethality of Zyklon B now refined organophosphate, toxicity curves. Rural workers fell ill, suffered deformities, and died, while Bayer sales representatives repeated the familiar refrain first heard in the heroin era. The products were entirely safe if used correctly. Meanwhile, the company expanded into blood products and vaccines, and in the 1970s and 80s one of its most modern and lethal scandals would emerge. A crime revealing that for the pharmacy, a human life still carried the same value it had in Auschwitz, the price of quarterly profit. By the late 1960s, Bayer had once again become one of the largest and most respected corporations on earth. Fritz Termeer died in 1967, honoured as a distinguished citizen, celebrated as a pioneer of industry and visionary of chemistry. Not a word spoken about the 150 women, not a single mention of the enslaved labourers of Monowitz. The amnesia was complete. Bayer had achieved the improbable, separating its products from its history. Millions swallowed its medicines daily, unaware that the foundations of the company rested upon a mass grave. The Bayer cross had become a symbol of hope, while the gas it once produced remained a symbol of absolute horror. Yet history does not move in a straight line of progress. It loops, returning to its point of origin, and the arrogance of executives, their conviction that they stood above law and morality, prepared the ground for the next catastrophe, because inside Bayer laboratories a new threat was about to intersect with corporate greed. In the next movement we enter the modern era, into the chilling contaminated blood scandal, in which deadly medicine was sold to thousands of haemophiliac children rather than sacrifice financial investment. We will see how the spirit of Auschwitz persisted into the 1980s and 90s, while the pharmacy continued collecting lives as the world looked away. By the late 1970s, Bayer was no longer a company attempting redemption but an undisputed global power. The Bayer cross dominated the health market worldwide. Coal soot had given way to the age of biotechnology and precision medicine. Laboratories of glass and steel resembled temples where solutions were engineered for conditions once considered death sentences. One such condition was haemophilia, a cruel genetic disorder preventing blood from clotting. For a haemophiliac, a minor knee bruise could trigger internal bleeding. A simple cut could prove fatal. For centuries, patients lived in constant fear, moving between hospital wards with drastically shortened life expectancy, and then Bayer's biological division, known in the United States as Cutter Biological, introduced what appeared to be a miracle therapy, Factor VIII, a protein concentrate derived from human plasma for haemophiliacs. Factor VIII meant freedom. They could self-administer injections at home and live something resembling a normal life. The product was so valuable and so costly to produce that within financial circles, it earned a nickname spoken with quiet reverence: liquid gold. Behind the soaring profits, the manufacture of this so-called liquid gold concealed a contamination risk buried deep within its supply chain, because producing a single dose of Factor VIII required plasma collected from thousands of donors, and in the pursuit of efficiency and margin expansion, the company did not always prioritize the healthier sources, instead drawing plasma from high-risk populations, prison inmates in the United States, intravenous drug users in impoverished neighborhoods, and desperately poor donors in developing countries who sold blood for the price of a meal. Each batch blended plasma from as many as 10,000 individuals inside vast stainless steel tanks, a biological roulette in which one infected donor could contaminate an entire production lot. Bayer understood this risk with clinical clarity. Its scientists were fully aware of hepatitis transmission and other viral dangers, yet the revenue stream was too valuable to interrupt for statistical probabilities. And then, in the early 1980s, a new spectre emerged, a virus not yet fully understood, spreading quietly through populations. HIV, the pathogen responsible for AIDS, and as confusion reigned over transmission pathways, physicians began noticing a horrifying pattern. Haemophiliacs were dying. By 1983, the evidence could no longer be dismissed. Bayer's Factor VIII concentrate was transmitting HIV to patients, children who had received the treatment so they could run, fall and play like other children were testing positive for a fatal infection. Families who had trusted the Bayer cross to protect their sons watched them deteriorate under a disease with no cure. The scale of the tragedy felt biblical in its cruelty, and Bayer and its American subsidiary Cutter Biological confronted a corporate dilemma. They could recall the product immediately, absorb millions in losses, and acknowledge failure, or they could attempt to preserve their investment. In 1984, Bayer engineers perfected a heat treatment process that inactivated HIV in Factor VIII concentrate, a scientific breakthrough that made the therapy significantly safer. The new heat-treated product was rapidly introduced in the United States and Western Europe. Patients in New York, London, and Berlin received safer treatment, but it was here that the company revealed a familiar face, one seen during the heroin era and in the shadow of Auschwitz. Warehouses still contained millions of dollars worth of untreated Factor VIII that the company knew carried a significant risk of HIV contamination. Two options existed: destroy the stock and accept financial loss, or sell it in markets where regulation was weak and patients were desperate. The company chose the latter. Internal documents later uncovered through investigative journalism and mass litigation revealed a commercial strategy that can only be described as calculated indifference. While safer product was distributed in wealthy nations, untreated concentrate continued to be exported to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Argentina, and Mexico. Imagine the boardroom in 1985. a report on the table indicating that a shipment bound for Taiwan carried a high probability of viral contamination, a safer alternative available in the adjacent facility, yet the decision weighed against quarterly balance sheets and inventory write-offs. Shipments proceeded, and representatives resisted pressure from health authorities in those countries to require the safer product. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, company officials argued the older concentrate was equally safe, and that the newer formulation was prohibitively expensive, actively misleading physicians and health ministries. The outcome unfolded as a silent catastrophe. Thousands of haemophiliacs across Asia and Latin America were knowingly exposed to infection, many of them children. In Taiwan, more than 100 haemophiliacs contracted HIV directly from the medication. Similar numbers appeared in Hong Kong, when activists and families demanded answers. Bayer responded with a strategy hauntingly familiar from earlier trials. Denial and obfuscation. Executives claimed the science had been uncertain at the time, despite internal memoranda indicating the opposite. They insisted their actions aligned with contemporary standards, yet the cruelty of the decision resists abstraction. It was not a technical error, but an accounting choice. The life of a child in Malaysia or Argentina weighed against the cost of discarding obsolete inventory. It was the spirit of E.G. Farben reborn in the age of globalization, the belief that certain populations could be treated as expendable if corporate gain justified the risk. And by the late 1990s, the scandal finally broke into the international press. Investigative reporting by the New York Times and other outlets triggered a wave of lawsuits. But once again, the pharmacy demonstrated its mastery of systems designed to hold power accountable, rather than risk courtroom testimony that might send executives to prison or permanently inscribe the full truth into public record. The company deployed its vast financial reserves to contain the crisis. Hundreds of millions of dollars were paid in settlements to victims and their families, yet those settlements came bound with strict confidentiality clauses. The money could fund medical care, but recipients were forbidden to speak to journalists or publicly assert corporate responsibility. Silence was purchased from the dying. There was no sincere public apology, no executive prosecuted for homicide or criminal negligence. For the corporation, the contaminated blood scandal became another operational cost, a negative figure in the ledger to be offset by future revenue from pesticides or cholesterol medication. The episode revealed that denazification had been superficial. The hierarchy of power, the primacy of dividends over ethics, and the reduction of patients to risk-bearing consumers remained embedded within the corporate core. As the new millennium approached, Bayer prepared for another transformation. Pharmaceuticals had secured its place in hospitals and medicine cabinets, but its ambitions extended towards something more fundamental than medicine: food, the control of what the world eats from seed to plate. To achieve this, the pharmacy turned its attention to another corporation whose reputation carried its own history of environmental devastation, an American company responsible for Agent Orange and polychlorinated biphenyls. Monsanto. The union of these two giants would create one of the most powerful chemical conglomerates in history, an entity positioned not only to supply medicines, but to shape the genetic foundation of agriculture. In the final movement of this story, we witness the acquisition of Monsanto, the global battles over glyphosate, and how after more than a century and a half of scandals, wars, and human suffering, Bayer remains among the most powerful corporations on Earth, raising the question of whether the Bayer cross represents healing or the emblem of an empire that has never ceased to regard human beings as commodities. Entering the 21st century, the pharmacy no longer sought dominance only in clinics and pharmacies. Its leadership, heirs to the strategic ambition of Karl Duisberg, recognized that control over food confers a power beyond the reach of any 20th century dictator. Bayer already held a commanding position in pesticides but pursued total integration. In 2016, it initiated the most ambitious and risky operation in its history, targeting a United States corporation whose notoriety rivaled the darkest chapters of E.G. Farben's past. Monsanto. This was no ordinary acquisition target. Monsanto had manufactured PCBs that contaminated waterways for decades, produced the defoliant Agent Orange that stripped the forests of Vietnam and left generations marked by deformities and cancer, and dominated global agriculture through genetically modified seeds and the world's most widely used herbicide, Roundup, based on glyphosate. When Bayer announced its $63 billion bid, financial analysts called it strategic consolidation, while environmental advocates and historians called it a marriage forged in catastrophe. The developers of Zyklon B joined with the producers of Agent Orange, a fusion of European and American chemical power, Despite global protests, the deal closed in June 2018, and in an attempt to distance itself from Monsanto's toxic public image, Bayer eliminated the Monsanto name entirely. The brand vanished, but its products, personnel, and most critically its legal liabilities were absorbed into Bayer's structure. The corporate cross now shielded the world's most dominant herbicide empire. Therapeutics. They will insist a 21st century corporation cannot be judged solely by the actions of I.G. Farben in the 1940s. Yet history is not a book that can be closed and discarded. It persists in archives, in the scars of survivors, and in present behaviour. A corporation that repeatedly places profit above human life across generations is not committing isolated mistakes. It is following its nature, and the next time you step into a pharmacy and see a white box marked with a blue cross, pause for a moment. Remember that the relief you seek has been financed through a century of tragedies. Remember that science is a powerful instrument, but in the grip of unchecked greed, it can become a weapon of mass destruction. The pharmacy remains open, its lights bright, floors immaculate, employees courteous, yet in the basement of memory the gas still drifts, the heroin remains bottled, and the price of a human life can still be reduced to a negotiable figure on a quarterly balance sheet. This is the true history of Bayer. Science for a better life, they say. But after everything we have seen, the question lingers in the air. Whose life?